Welcome to the Envoy of Venice, a newsletter and podcast focusing on international politics. In this episode, we focus on the relationship dynamics between Russia and Iran. Analysis by Greta Hahn. In recent years, both Russia and Iran have experienced a heated international atmosphere around themselves. Hence, the two states have recognized that, in closer cooperation, it can be easier for both parties to address the new challenges they are facing as a result of their conflicts. Although the increased level of cooperation has been forced by international pressure and sanctions imposed against them, the relationship between Iran and Russia has been evolving for several years and is gradually expanding into more and more sectors. Meanwhile, the limited war that started on 13th June with Israel's attack on Iran has shown who the parties concerned can count on beyond rhetoric, in fact, in a sharp situation. Although Russia's assets and opportunities are limited due to its war in Ukraine, it is worth examining its relationship with Iran in this respect, considering that Iran is one of the few countries that directly helped Moscow in the Russia-Ukraine war. Reciprocity or lack thereof should be interpreted in sight of the agreements concluded and the depth of the relationship between the two states. Looking at the details of this relationship, it is easier to understand Russia's reaction to the attack on its partner. The evolved conflicts, such as the Russian-Ukrainian and Iranian-Israeli wars, have a double effect. On the one hand, they are converging Tehran and Moscow. On the other, they are imposing limits on their closer cooperation. In the following, we will review the gradual development of relations between Russia and Iran and its pivotal points, taking into account the confrontations that affect them. There are demands for cooperation, money not so much. The rapprochement between the two countries is mainly a result of conflicts of interest with the West, because in the global space, they are both taking a stand against a liberal international order and an international system controlled by the United States. The criticism and restrictions, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, a form of systematic pressure, coming from the West, have in fact predicted that Russia and Iran will be placed on a common platform. The relationship that has been continuously developing between the two countries for decades has become a partnership in the military, economic, and political spheres. However, the cooperation still can be described as a kind of loose relationship, because structural differences and differences of interest between the two parties prevent the emergence of a comprehensive alliance. The Russian side is being penalized by a wide range of sanctions, imposed by the West and its closely allied global partners, due to the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and its open war with Ukraine since February 2022. The restrictions affect the energy sector, which is of paramount importance to Russia, financial institutions, and access to the global markets for Russian economic actors. As a result of the Western countermeasures, Moscow has strengthened its relations with Tehran, since Iran has also been a country bearing with international sanctions and diplomatic isolation for a long time. The restrictions on Iran have been reinforced during the first presidency of U.S. President Donald Trump, especially after Trump exited the U.S. from the Comprehensive Joint Action Plan, JCPOA, nuclear agreement with Iran in 2018. The U.S. administration then also restricted Iranian oil exports and international financial transactions. The administration of Joe Biden has pursued a less aggressive policy towards Iran, but has maintained most of the restrictions. Tehran has thus further deepened its relations with states that are in challenging status for the current international system. Cooperation has developed to the point where Iran became a member of the organization BRICS from the 1st of January 2024. Another example of strengthening economic cooperation with the Eastern partners is the International North-South Transport Corridor, INSTC, which would reduce the current 30 to 45 days transport time between St. Petersburg and Mumbai to only 10 days. However, the implementation of the project is progressing slowly due to the financial and infrastructure deficiencies. In many respects, this initiative is also a reflection of a significant proportion of the Russian-Iranian cooperation envisaged by the bilateral agreements, as many projects are stuck in the preparatory phase because they do not have the necessary financial resources to implement. Thus, the practical implementation of cooperation often comes to a halt, preventing the relationship between the two countries from deepening. Nuclear issues. The Iranian nuclear program, which is one of the focal points of the outbreak of the Israeli-Iranian war, is also linked to bilateral cooperation between Russia and Iran. Russia is one of Iran's main partners in the civil use of nuclear energy. Among other things, the Russians have contributed greatly to the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant and to the supply of enriched uranium to the plant. Following the launch of the nuclear power plant, the international community was afraid that Iran would start producing nuclear weapons besides producing energy. Many international actors have therefore responded sensitively to Russian-Iranian cooperation in this area. In line with its official statements, Russia, as a supporter of nuclear non-proliferation, cannot and has not shown any willingness to hand over such weapons or the technology needed to produce them to any partner, including Iran. It is probably not in its interest to create another nuclear power that weakens its position in the region. In 2015, Russia was a party to the previously mentioned JCPOA convention, signed also by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the European Union as a separate entity, and China, as well as by Iran, which had restricted Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting most of the sanctions previously imposed. We're helping, but have some exceptions. The rapprochement of the two countries reached a new level with the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war and its unforeseen prolongation. Then the Russian side, facing the realities of the battlefield, sought out Tehran with a plan to procure and co-build military drones. Iran has been inclined to provide assistance and has supported its Russian partner, mainly in the early stages of the war, with significant drone shipments, and has helped to build the plants and the related infrastructure where Russia can produce these instruments for itself. With regard to the drones, Russia seems to have stood on its own, since it is now capable of producing about 2,700 drones every month, without the help of its Iranian partner, on whom it relied more in the first 2 years of the war. The development of this sector of the Russian forces, without Iranian support, could not have been achieved. As a major formal step forward, it is to be seen that during the war, cooperation between Iran and Russia has been formally framed, as on 17 January 2025, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a strategic partnership agreement in Moscow. The 20-year agreement covers a number of areas, including security, economic and financial integration, science, education and culture, transport and infrastructure, energy and nuclear cooperation, geopolitical and diplomatic coordination. The agreed cooperation is diversified and involves a number of priority sectors, but one important element has been omitted with the agreement of the parties, namely the Mutual Protection Clause, which would oblige the two countries to provide military assistance. This has a great importance regarding the behavior demonstrated during each other's conflicts. Russia on a forced track. Cooperation between the two countries was under the spotlight again for the general public with the outbreak of the Israel-Iran war. The question then arose as to whether Russia would provide some form of military support to Iran in the conflict that it got involved, taking into account the military assistance previously provided by Iran to Russia. As mentioned above, a comprehensive agreement was reached between Moscow and Tehran about half a year before the war. However, in the absence of a mutual defense clause, which was also discussed above, Russia has no legal obligation to its partner in this area. The reference to this has rightly been exploited by Moscow, who advocated a diplomatic settlement to the conflict. Another excuse for Moscow is the prioritization of its own war, which gives Moscow largely no meaningful or only very limited opportunities to provide assistance. As long as Russia cannot end its war with Ukraine, it cannot invest significantly in another armed conflict, especially if its fundamental interests are not directly affected. Taking any step will force Russia to make political and diplomatic calculations, as with providing military support for Iran, could undermine its other international and regional relations. This move could jeopardize his relationship with the United States, which is now showing positive signs, or more importantly, his relationship with the countries of the Middle East and the Gulf, with whom his cooperation has greatly helped to counteract the Western sanctions. These countries do not support the strengthening of Iran, and Moscow therefore stresses the need to end the conflict through diplomatic channels in order to avoid risking its relations in this regard. During his telephone conversations with Trump and the leaders of the warring parties, Putin also offered to take the role of mediator. In addition, Moscow can assist Iran in the diplomatic field within international organizations. For example, as Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it could stand with Iran on issues that are on the Council's agenda. The strangely unfinished Israel-Iran war generated profit for Russia in the short term due to the rise in oil prices. It was also beneficial for the Russians that temporarily global attention was drawn away from their own war. In the long term, however, the deepening of the crisis would not be beneficial for Moscow. Russia was Iran's largest foreign investor last year, with investing significant amounts in the country's projects. Russia plans to continue to make a number of strategically important investments in the region, which would not be feasible in case of Iran's weakening and the possible collapse of the regime. Therefore, it is in Russia's interest to bring about a lasting end to the conflict but can only offer diplomatic assistance. From 24th June, Iran and Israel settled their existing conflict with a ceasefire, but in the absence of a lasting agreement, the tension between them could get high at any time, resulting in new clashes. The risk of the ceasefire getting nullified at any time is also justified by the statements and attitude of both parties. Currently, there is a sort of mediated image war between the two parties, based on a comparison of profits and losses, and in most cases, a disproportionate presentation of these factors. In terms of the realities in the battlefield, none of the parties has won a decisive victory nor been defeated in the clashes. Hereafter, if the conflict will not be resolved through diplomatic means, the parties could easily decide on choosing the armed solution to resolve the disagreements between them. An agreement should therefore be reached as soon as possible, with the possible help of Russia and the US assisting the opposing parties in the negotiation process. My war, your war. The Iranian regime has been rather shaken by the clash with Israel, which also means limited possibilities for further supporting Moscow. Likewise, the Russian side, because of the focus in Ukraine, is unable to provide significant assistance to their Iranian partners. It is thus confirmed that the military sector will not be the most significant one regarding the cooperation of the parties. In addition, the current conflicts can also cast some shadow over their existing relationship. Conclusion. To sum up, the history of Russian-Iranian rapprochement is accompanied by a number of milestones indicating ever closer cooperation, but there are also a number of obstacles in the way of further deepening their relationship. The burden of the Russian-Ukrainian and Iranian-Israeli wars and the losses suffered are obviously setting limits for the warring parties and restricting their room for international cooperation. In many cases, beside the lack of capacity, there is also a lack of political willingness to provide assistance, because with that, the parties could risk a possible negative change of direction regarding their other international relations. They are also facing similar problems in the economic field, particularly the Russian side, who does not want to limit the number of its trading partners and wants to diversify its cooperation regarding the energy sector. Nevertheless, the deepening of cooperation is perhaps the most likely for this sector, as the parties can continue to work together to counteract the Western sanctions, which are not expected to be lifted in the near future. In addition, both of them aim to do business with trading partners who do not use US dollar accounts for transactions. Russia and Iran are therefore moving away from the Western states on external pressure and because of their own long-term interests. An in-depth joint cooperation could also be a catalyst for their future development, despite their constraints. I hope you enjoyed our show. If so, please follow us on the platform you are listening to our podcast and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. theenvoyofvenice.substack.com. Until next time.